Millionaire finds abandoned child in church and discovers a secret that will change his life forever. Richard, stop the car, he suddenly ordered the driver, his eyes fixed on something outside. But, sir, we're in the middle of the storm, Richard protested. I said stop, repeated James with the authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. The limousine stopped in front of Grace Cathedral, a historic building in the heart of the metropolis. James grabbed his umbrella and exited the vehicle, immediately being assaulted by the force of the rain and wind. His Italian shoes sank into puddles as he approached the church steps. It was there that he saw her, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, completely soaked, shivering with cold under the small overhang that barely offered protection. She wore simple, worn clothes and clutched a yellowed envelope to her chest as if it were her most precious possession. James approached slowly, trying not to frighten her. Hello, little one. What are you doing here alone in this storm? The girl raised her eyes of such a deep brown that they seemed to contain entire universes, but didn't say a word. Her pale face and slightly blue lips revealed that she was sick. Do you have family? Someone who can take care of you? James insisted. Again, only silence. The girl merely clutched the envelope tighter against her chest, as if fearing someone might take it. Something in that gaze moved James in a way he couldn't explain. It was as if something dormant inside him had suddenly awakened. Come with me, he said, extending his hand. I'll take you to a safe place. For a moment James thought she would refuse, but then slowly the girl extended her small, trembling hand and held his. In the limousine, James removed his cashmere coat and wrapped it around the child, who was shaking uncontrollably. Richard, to Memorial Hospital, now. As the vehicle cut through the flooded streets of New York, James observed the girl with curiosity. There was something familiar about her, something he couldn't quite define. What's your name? He asked. The girl just looked at him with those deep eyes without answering. James noticed she was holding the envelope so tightly that her knuckles were white. It's okay, you don't have to talk if you don't want to, he said, trying to reassure her. When they arrived at the hospital, James carried the child in his arms into the emergency room. I need a doctor immediately, he demanded with the voice he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Dr. Laura Adams, one of the best pediatricians at the hospital, personally answered the call. While she examined the girl, James waited in the waiting room, his cell phone ringing incessantly with calls that, for the first time in decades, didn't seem important. Mr. Williams, the doctor called after an hour that seemed like an eternity. How is she? Asked James, getting up quickly. She has pneumonia in its early stages, as well as malnutrition and exhaustion. We'll keep her under observation, but she needs continuous care. Are you related to her? No, I found her in front of the church, alone in the rain. I see. In that case, we'll need to contact Child Protective Services, said Dr. Laura, making notes on her clipboard. Did she say anything, tell you her name? Asked James. No, apparently she doesn't speak. It could be trauma or some condition we'll need to investigate. James nodded, thoughtful. Can I see her? The doctor led him to a private room where the girl was lying in a bed that seemed too big for her fragile body. IVs and monitors were connected to her, and the yellowed envelope was in her lap, her small hands still holding it firmly even during the medication-induced sleep. What's in that envelope that she won't let go of? Asked James. We don't know. She wouldn't allow anyone to touch it. We had to promise not to take it from her in order to administer the medications. James approached the bed and observed the sleeping girl. There was something about her that awakened a strange emotion within him, something between protection and recognition. Doctor, what will happen to her after she's discharged? Since we have no information about family, she'll probably be sent to a temporary institution until they find a substitute family or a permanent shelter. James felt a tightness in his chest upon hearing those words. The idea of that child being taken to a shelter, after all she had already faced, seemed unbearable to him. What if I wanted to care for her temporarily, while we discover more about her origin? The doctor looked at him with surprise. James Williams was known for his coldness in business and his extremely private personal life. Seeing him show interest in an abandoned child was, at the very least, unexpected. That would involve a process with Child Protective Services, evaluations, interviews. "Do whatever is necessary," interrupted James. "I have resources and lawyers to expedite any process." At that moment, as he watched the girl sleep, James couldn't explain even to himself what he was feeling. It was as if some greater force had placed him in that place, at that hour, to find that specific child. The next day, while the girl was still sleeping, James received a visit from Amanda Parker, the social worker assigned to the case by Child Protective Services. "Mr. Williams, I confess I'm surprised," said Amanda, a middle-aged woman with a severe expression. "Your reputation precedes you, and caring for a vulnerable child doesn't seem to match your profile." James maintained his impeccable posture. "I believe people can surprise, Mrs. Parker, especially themselves. I understand, but I need to be clear. We will not allow this child to be used as some kind of charity project or public relations to improve your company's image." James felt his blood boil at the insinuation, but kept his calm. "I have no interest in publicity. In fact, I prefer that this remains in absolute secrecy. Still, I'll need to evaluate your residence, your background, your ability to care for a child with possible deep traumas. The process can take weeks, even months." "Does the girl have somewhere to go in the meantime?" asked James. Amanda hesitated. "We have temporary shelters, but they're all overcrowded. It wouldn't be the ideal environment for a child who doesn't communicate verbally and is recovering from an illness." "Then let me help," insisted James. "I have a house with all the necessary structure. I can hire nurses, psychologists, whatever is needed to ensure her well-being." The social worker studied him for a long moment before responding. "We can consider temporary custody, strictly monitored. But I'll need to talk to the girl first, even if she doesn't respond." When they entered the room, they found the girl awake, sitting on the bed, still holding the envelope. Her large eyes scanned the visitors with a disconcerting intensity for someone so young. "Hello, dear," said Amanda, approaching carefully. "My name is Amanda. I'm here to help you." The girl just observed, showing no reaction. "Do you remember this gentleman? He brought you to the hospital last night." To the surprise of both, the girl nodded slightly, her eyes fixed on James. "Can you tell us your name?" Amanda tried again. No response. "Do you know where your parents or any relatives are?" The girl lowered her eyes, clutching the envelope even tighter. Amanda tried several other questions, always receiving silence as an answer. Finally, she turned to James. "I'll need authorization from a judge for temporary custody. In the meantime, I'll check the records of missing children, see if I find any match." James nodded. "Thank you. I'll do whatever I can to help." After Amanda left, James approached the bed. "Hello again," he said, feeling strangely nervous. "I know you're not talking, and that's okay, but I want you to know that I'll take care of you until we find your family, all right?" The girl studied him for a moment and then, to James's complete surprise, extended the envelope in his direction. "For me?" asked James, confused. The girl nodded. Carefully, James took the envelope. It was old, yellowed by time, with moisture, stains. It was sealed, as if it had never been opened. "You want me to open it?" Another affirmative nod. James opened the envelope carefully to avoid damaging it. Inside was a handwritten letter in an elegant but shaky handwriting, like that of a very elderly person. As he began to read the first lines, James felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. "Dear Mr. James Williams, if this letter has reached your hands, it means that my great-granddaughter Annie has managed to find you as instructed. My name is Olivia Harris, mother of Claire, grandmother of Rose, and I am writing this letter in my last days of life." James stopped reading, his heart racing. Rose, a name that he had tried to bury in the past for more than 3 decades. He looked at the girl in the bed, those deep brown eyes that had awakened something familiar in him. "Are you Rose's daughter?" he asked with a choked voice. The girl nodded slowly. James felt his legs weaken and had to sit down. He resumed reading the letter with trembling hands. Rose always knew that you were the great love of her life, even after circumstances separated you. She never told you about her pregnancy, respecting your decision to follow another path. When your family opposed your relationship, she raised our Lily alone with all the love in the world, but she always told the girl about the father she had, a good man who had to make difficult choices. When Rose fell ill, her last request was that if anything happened to Lily as well, I would ensure that Annie found her grandfather. This letter should have reached you years ago, when Lily passed away in 2018, but for some reason it was forgotten. In the mail until recently, when it was finally returned to our family. Annie is 8 years old now. She stopped speaking after her mother's passing. Doctors say it's a deep trauma. She has only you now, James, the blood of your blood. If you are reading this, I am no longer here to take care of her, I ask, not for me or for Rose, but for innocent Annie, that you welcome her. She is part of you, the continuation of a love that should never have been interrupted. With respect and hope, Olivia Harris. James raised his eyes from the letter, meeting the girl's gaze, his granddaughter. Now he understood why those eyes seemed so familiar. They were Rose's eyes, the woman he had loved deeply in his youth before yielding to family pressures and his own ambitions. Annie, he said, testing the name. Your name is Annie? The girl nodded again. Annie, repeated James, feeling an overwhelming emotion. I'm your grandfather. The tears that James had repressed for decades finally found their way, flowing freely down his face. He, who had built walls around his own heart, felt them crumbling before this silent child. I didn't know. I never knew about your mother. Lily, if I had known... Annie extended her small hand and touched James's face, as if she wanted to dry his tears. It was such an unexpected gesture, so full of compassion, that James felt his heart break and mend at the same time. At that moment, he knew his life would never be the same. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions and procedures. James mobilized his legal team to expedite the temporary custody process, while social worker Amanda investigated the veracity of the story. Confirmation came quickly. Lily Harris had indeed passed away 2 years ago, leaving her daughter Annie in the care of her great-grandmother Olivia, who in turn had passed away just 3 months ago. The girl had been temporarily cared for by a neighbor, but had disappeared 2 weeks ago, apparently in a determined search for the grandfather she had never met, following instructions left by her great-grandmother. As the letter had explained, she had stopped speaking after her mother's death. Doctors called it selective mutism, a symptom of the deep trauma she had experienced. Dr. Laura recommended that Annie remain in the hospital for a few more days, not just for the pneumonia, but also to perform more detailed examinations. Mr. Williams, the doctor called on one of the days with a concerned expression. We found something in Annie's tests that needs your urgent attention. James felt a chill down his spine. What is it? Annie has a congenital heart condition that needs to be closely monitored. It's possible she may need surgery in the future. Do whatever is necessary. Money is not an issue. The doctor nodded. We've also prepared a multidisciplinary team to help her with the trauma. Therapist, child psychologist, speech therapist. I want the best, said James, and I want to adapt my house to receive her as soon as possible. While James waited for clearance to take Annie home, he received an unexpected visit at the hospital. His adopted son, Greg. At 40, Greg was James's right-hand man in business, having been adopted by him and his ex-wife Elizabeth when he was 12 years old. The couple had divorced more than 15 years ago, and Elizabeth currently lived in Europe. Dad, what's this story I'm hearing? Asked Greg as soon as he entered the private waiting room. You found a granddaughter you didn't know existed? James sighed. He should have imagined that the news would reach Greg's ears eventually. It's true, Annie is the daughter of Lily, who in turn was the daughter of Rose, a woman I knew even before I met your mother. And you believe this story just like that, based only on a letter? The documents have been verified, Greg, and even without that, you would only need to look into her eyes to know. She has Rose's eyes. Greg ran a hand through his hair, visibly disturbed. Dad, you need to consider the possibility that this is a setup, a child appearing out of nowhere with a convenient letter. "It's not a setup," interrupted James firmly. "Annie is my granddaughter and I will take care of her." "And how does this affect the business? The succession of the company? You built an empire to be passed on, and now I have a granddaughter who needs me," completed James. "The business continues as it is, Greg. Your position is not threatened, if that's what concerns you." Greg tried to disguise his discomfort. "It's not that, Dad. I'm just worried about you. It's a big change in your life." "A necessary change, perhaps," responded James thoughtfully. When Greg left, James returned to Annie's room. She was awake, drawing on a pad that a nurse had given her. "Hello, Annie," said James, sitting beside the bed. "What are you drawing?" Annie turned the pad to show him. It was a drawing of a large house with a garden full of trees. In the garden there was a specific tree with small circles that looked like fruit. "It's a beautiful house," commented James. "Is it the house where you lived with your mother?" Annie shook her head negatively. "Is it a house you would like to have?" She nodded, her eyes bright. "Well, I have a big house, but I confess it doesn't have many trees in the garden. Perhaps we can plant some when you come to live with me. What do you think of this special tree you drew? What fruit is that?" Annie took a pencil and carefully wrote next to the drawing, "Cherry." It was the first time James saw her communicate through writing, and he felt a wave of hope. "Cherry, is that your favorite fruit?" she wrote again. "Mum said you and Grandma kissed for the first time under a cherry tree." James felt his heart stop for an instant. It was true. He and Rose had shared their first kiss under a cherry tree in her family's backyard, more than 40 years ago. How could Annie know that? "Your mother told you that?" he asked, moved. Annie nodded, drawing more details on the tree. At that moment, James understood that Annie was not just a link to his past. She was the guardian of memories he had tried to forget, but that remained alive through stories passed from mother to daughter. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. A week later, Annie was discharged from the hospital, and James could finally take her home. During this time, he had dedicated himself to preparing a special room for her, consulting with child development specialists to ensure the environment would be welcoming and therapeutic. James's mansion, located in the prestigious Westchester County, was an imposing construction, with more than 20,000 square feet, a swimming pool, tennis court, and a well-maintained garden, though too formal for a child. He had hired a landscape designer to add more playful elements, and of course a cherry tree had been planted in a special spot in the garden. When the car entered through the gates of the mansion, James observed Annie's reaction in the rear-view mirror. Her eyes took in everything with curiosity, but without the awe he expected. It was as if she already knew the place. "Welcome to your new home," he said when the driver opened the door. Annie got out of the car holding the small suitcase with the new clothes James had bought for her. Her steps were hesitant as she climbed the entrance steps. Upon entering the mansion, they were greeted by Martha, the housekeeper who had worked for James for more than 20 years. "This is Annie," introduced James, "my granddaughter." Martha, a southern lady with a heart bigger than the world, bent, down to be at the girl's height. "Pleased to meet you, Annie. It's good to have a child in this house again. It was needing a little joy around here." Annie offered a small smile, the first James had seen on her face. "Come, I want to show you your room," said James, extending his hand. Annie held his hand, and together they climbed the marble staircase to the second floor. The room James had prepared was spacious, painted in soft shades of green and blue. There was a canopy bed, shelves with children's books, a desk for drawing, and on the balcony a small rocking chair with a view of the garden. "I hope you like it," said James, suddenly anxious for his granddaughter's approval. "We can change anything you want." Annie walked slowly around the room, touching the books, the bed's quilt, the curtains, as if she were absorbing every detail. Then she stopped in front of a painting on the wall, a painting of a cherry tree loaded with fruit. "I had it made especially for you," explained James, "until our tree in the garden grows and bears fruit." Annie turned to him and, for the first time, opened her arms in a silent request for a hug. James felt a lump in his throat as he bent down to hug her. It was as if, at that moment, decades of emotional coldness were being melted by the warmth of that small body. Days turned into weeks, and Annie's presence brought profound changes not just to the mansion, but to James himself. He, who had never missed a business meeting, now reorganized his schedule to be present at Annie's therapy sessions. The house, previously silent and impeccable, now had drawings on the refrigerator and occasional sneaker footprints on the marble floor. Annie still didn't speak, but communicated more and more through drawings and small written notes. Her drawings, however, intrigued not only James, but also Dr. Megan, the child psychologist who attended to her 3 times a week. "Mr. Williams," called Dr. Megan after one of the sessions, "Annie's drawings are peculiar." "In what sense?" asked James. "She draws places and situations that, from what I understand, she has never experienced, scenes from the past, memories that seem to be from your youth, Mr. Williams, or from Rose's youth." James nodded, thoughtful. "I noticed that too. She drew the backyard where I met Rose with details that couldn't be in any photo. It's as if she had access to memories that aren't hers," continued the psychologist. "In my notes, I call it inherited memory, although it's not a scientific term. I have seen cases of very sensitive children who seem to absorb family stories so deeply that they transform them into their own memories. And is that normal? Let's say it's a way Annie has found to process the trauma and maintain a connection with the mother and grandmother she lost. In her dreams, as she shows me in drawings, she talks to both." James felt a shiver. "She dreams of Rose? How does she know what Rose looked like?" "According to what I can interpret from her drawings, her mother showed her photos and told stories, but there's something more intuitive in her connection to the family past." That conversation left James thoughtful. That night, as he tucked Annie in, a ritual that had become sacred to him, he observed the various drawings hanging on the walls of the room. "Annie," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed, "these drawings you make of Grandma Rose and the places where we were, how do you know these details?" Annie picked up her notepad and wrote, "Mum told me stories, and I dream." "And in your dreams, do you talk to Grandma Rose?" She nodded, writing again. "She says you kept the blue scarf." James felt his blood freeze. The blue silk scarf that Rose had given him as a memento the last time they saw each other. He kept it in a locked box in his personal safe. He had never mentioned it to anyone, not even to his ex-wife. How could you know that, Annie?" She just shrugged as if the answer were obvious and wrote, "Grandma Rose knows. She sees you." That night, James had difficulty sleeping. Annie's words resonated in his mind, along with memories of Rose that he had tried to suppress for so long. He remembered the day his parents confronted him, saying that a simple girl from the countryside wasn't suitable for the heir of a rising empire. He remembered how he yielded to the pressure, how he told Rose that their worlds were incompatible, how he ignored her tears, convincing himself it was best for both of them. And now, decades later, fate had brought Annie into his life, a living reminder that some bonds are never truly broken. The next morning, James was surprised by a call from social worker Amanda. "Mr. Williams, I need to make an unscheduled visit today. It's standard procedure in cases of temporary custody." "Of course, Mrs. Parker, we'll be waiting." Amanda arrived in the early afternoon, when Annie was having her lesson with the private tutor James had hired, to keep her up with her studies while she wasn't yet ready to attend a regular school. "Impressive," commented Amanda, as James guided her through the house, showing the adaptations made for Annie. "I confess I didn't expect such a level of commitment." "Annie deserves the best," replied James simply. "And how is she adapting? Any progress in verbal communication?" "She still doesn't speak but communicates very well through writing and drawings. The psychologist says the mutism is a protection she created, and with time and security she will speak again when she's ready." Amanda nodded. "And your work routine? How have you reconciled it with caring for her?" "I've reorganized my schedule. Greg, my adopted son, has taken on more responsibilities at the company, and I work more from home now." "I see. And how has your son reacted to this new sister?" James hesitated. "Greg is adjusting. It's a big change for all of us." In truth, Greg had grown increasingly distant in the past few weeks. His visits to the mansion, once frequent, had become rare, always with the excuse of too much work. When he did come, he maintained a superficial politeness with Annie, never really engaging with her. "Mr. Williams, I should inform you that we are proceeding with the permanent custody process. Considering the exceptional circumstances and Annie's evident well-being, the judge is inclined to grant permanent custody as long as we continue with regular monitoring." James felt a wave of relief. That's great news. "There's one more thing," continued Amanda, her tone subtly changing. "During our investigations into Annie's background, we discovered something interesting. Are you familiar with St. Clair's Orphanage upstate?" "The name isn't unfamiliar," replied James, trying to recall. "That's where Lily, Annie's mother, grew up after becoming an orphan in her teens. The orphanage is about to be closed due to lack of resources." "And how does this relate to Annie?" Amanda adjusted her glasses, studying James's reaction. "Well, according to the records we found, Rose would have left Annie in Lily's care when she was only 2 years old, saying she needed to resolve important matters. She never returned. Lily, who had been raised in the orphanage, continued to maintain contact with the institution, helping as she could. James felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Rose abandoned her granddaughter. We're not sure if it was abandonment. There are indications that she was ill and didn't want her daughter and granddaughter to see her waste away. The fact is that she disappeared, and Lily raised Annie alone with Olivia's support until she also became ill." James processed that information slowly. "And the orphanage? You said it's going to close?" "Yes, the building is old and needs urgent renovations. Without investments, the local government has determined closure in 3 months. The 30 children living there will be redistributed to other shelters in the region." James noticed Amanda's meaningful look. "Are you suggesting I should help the orphanage?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Williams. Just sharing information that might be relevant to Annie's family history. What you do with this information is entirely your decision." After Amanda left, James found Annie in the garden, observing the newly planted cherry tree. He approached silently, thinking about how to address the subject of the orphanage. "It's growing well, isn't it?" he commented, referring to the tree. Annie smiled, nodding. "Annie, do you remember the place where your mother grew up? A place called St. Clair's Orphanage?" Her eyes lit up with recognition. She ran inside and came back with her drawing pad, flipping through until she found what she was looking for, a detailed drawing of an old building with a front garden and a large cross on top. "Is this the place?" asked James, surprised by the precision of the drawing. Annie nodded enthusiastically, writing, "Mom took me there. There are many children. Sister Carmen makes cornbread." "Did you like going there?" She wrote, "Yes, but Mom was sad sometimes." "Why?" She said she wished she could help more, that the children deserved a better place. James looked at the girl, so small and already having faced so many losses, and then at the huge mansion where they lived, with empty rooms and excess luxury. An idea was beginning to form in his mind. "Annie, what would you think if we helped make St. Clair's Orphanage a better place, as a gift for your mother and for all the children who live there?" The smile that illuminated Annie's face was answer enough. The next morning, James convened an extraordinary meeting of the board of directors of the Williams Group. Greg, as executive vice president, sat at his right, visibly tense. "Ladies and gentlemen," began James, "I've called this meeting to announce a new project for our philanthropic arm, the complete restructuring of St. Clair's Orphanage." There were murmurs of surprise in the room. The Williams Group had a foundation that made occasional donations to various causes, but had never taken on a large-scale project with a social focus. James continued, presenting slides with images of the orphanage in its current state and preliminary architectural plans for its renovation. It will not just be a renovation, but a complete reimagining of the space. We will create an integrated educational center with a school, medical, care, cultural and recreational spaces. "What is the estimated cost of this project?" asked one of the directors. "Approximately $5 million, replied James with tranquility, as if he were talking about an insignificant amount. More murmurs, now of concern. "Dad," intervened. "Greg, that represents almost the entire annual budget of the foundation, not to mention it's well above what we normally approve for single projects. That's why I'm proposing an expansion of the foundation's budget and a restructuring of its priorities," replied James. "I also intend to make a significant personal donation." The tension was palpable in the room. For decades, James Williams had been known for his coldness in business, for decisions based exclusively on financial return. Seeing him now proposing a massive investment in a social project was, at the very least, disconcerting for those who knew him. "Mr. Williams," spoke Sarah Reynolds, financial director, "we understand that you have a personal involvement with this specific project, given the connection with your granddaughter. But we need to consider the impact on the foundation's other commitments." "I understand the concern," replied James. "That's precisely why I'm proposing an increase in the total budget, not a redirection of existing funds. Additionally, I intend to establish a new model of philanthropy for the group, more focused on deep and lasting impact." The meeting extended for hours, with heated discussions about budgets, priorities, and the company's public image. In the end, the board approved the project with reservations and a gradual implementation timeline. As the directors left the room, Greg remained, visibly displeased. $5 million on an orphanage, Dad. That doesn't make financial sense, and you know it." "Not everything in life needs to make financial sense, Greg." "That doesn't sound like you," retorted Greg. "Since that girl appeared, you've been acting like a different person." James sighed, feeling the weight of his son's accusatory look. "Perhaps I'm becoming the person I should have been a long time ago." "And what about the projects we had? The international expansion, the new commercial complex downtown?" "They're still on, just with adjustments to the timeline. Greg, this isn't a zero-sum game. We can do both things." Greg shook his head, incredulous. "It's her, isn't it, Annie? She's manipulating you somehow." "She's an 8-year-old child who barely speaks, Greg. The only thing she's done is show me that there's more to life than balance sheets and stock appreciation." "And what about me, Dad? Where do I fit in this new life you're building?" The vulnerability in Greg's voice caught James by surprise. Behind the anger and frustration, there was a real fear. The fear of being replaced, of losing his place in the life of the father who had adopted him. "Greg," said James, softening his tone, "you are my son. Nothing will change that. Annie isn't here to take your place, but to join our family. There's room for both of you." "It's hard to believe that when you cancel our strategic meetings to accompany her to the doctor, or redesign the entire future of the company because of her. I'm trying to balance things, son. It's an adjustment process for all of us." Greg picked up his folder and headed for the door. "I just hope you don't regret it when you realize you're being used." After Greg's exit, James remained alone in the meeting room, contemplating the photo he now kept in his wallet, Annie smiling, sitting on the swing he had installed in the mansion's garden. In just a few weeks, that silent child had transformed his life in ways he never imagined possible. That afternoon, James took Annie to personally visit St. Clair's Orphanage. Located in a small town 2 hours from New York, the place was exactly as Annie had drawn it. An old building with a colonial facade, surrounded by a simple but well-maintained garden and a large cross on top. As they got out of the car, James noticed Annie's excitement. For the first time, she seemed truly anxious, squeezing his hand as they walked to the entrance. They were greeted by Sister Carmen, the orphanage's director, a lady of about 70, with a welcoming smile despite the marks of worry on her face. "Mr. Williams, what an honor to receive you," she said, leading them down the main corridor. "When I received your call, I could hardly believe it." "The honor is mine, Sister Carmen," replied James. "Annie has good memories of this place." Sister's eyes lit up as she recognized the girl. "Annie, my God, how you've grown. Lily used to bring you here almost every month." Annie smiled shyly, partially hiding behind James. "Still not speaking?" the sister asked James in a low voice. "No, but she communicates well in other ways. She's in therapy." The sister nodded with understanding. "Lily also went without speaking for almost a year after she arrived here. Trauma does that to children." As they toured the facilities, James noted the painful contrast between the evident dedication of the staff and the precariousness of the facilities. Walls with infiltrations, worn furniture, toys mended several times. The children, on the other hand, received them with contagious enthusiasm, especially when they discovered that Annie had visited the place before. In a few minutes, she was integrated into a group playing in the yard, apparently comfortable in a familiar environment. "Sister Carmen," said James as he watched the children playing, "I want to discuss my plans for this place." "Your lawyers mentioned something about a renovation, Mr. Williams. We're very grateful, but I fear it's too late. The local government has already determined the closure. It won't just be a renovation, sister. I intend to completely rebuild the orphanage, transforming it into a model educational and welcoming center, and we're already working with the local government to reverse the closure decision." The sister blinked several times as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "But why? You barely know us." James observed Annie, who had joined a group of children drawing with chalk on the yard floor. "Let's say I have a debt to the past, sister, and I believe this is a way to start paying it." During the visit, James got to know every corner of the orphanage and talk to all the staff, making detailed notes about needs and possible improvements. Annie, in turn, seemed to flourish in that environment, interacting with the other children in a way she had never done before. When it was time to leave, Annie said goodbye to each child with a hug, and James promised Sister Carmen they would return soon with the team of architects and engineers. On the way back to New York, James noticed that Annie was unusually agitated, rapidly flipping through her drawing pad. "Is everything okay, Annie?" he asked. She stopped on a specific page and showed him a drawing of a tall man with dark hair, with the word "danger" written in large red letters above him. "Who is this man?" asked James, concerned. Annie wrote hastily, "He was there, watching, bad man, at the orphanage. You saw this man today?" She nodded vigorously, writing, "He doesn't like you, wants to hurt." James felt a chill run down his spine. "Annie, have you seen this man before?" She shook her head negatively, then wrote, "Dreamed of him. He was with Uncle Greg." Those words lit an alert in James's mind. Could it be that Greg was plotting something behind his back? So upset was he with the new directions of the company. "Annie, are you sure of what you saw? It's a serious accusation." She bit her lip, looking uncertain for the first time, and then wrote, "Didn't see them together today, just dreamed before." James took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. Annie's dreams had proven strangely accurate regarding the past, but that didn't mean they were prophetic about the future or totally reliable in the present. "Let's keep our eyes open, okay? If you see that man again, let me know immediately." Annie nodded, seeming relieved to have been taken seriously. Upon returning to the mansion, they were greeted by Martha with worrying news. "Mr. Williams, doctor. Laura called several times asking you to contact her urgently. It seems that Annie's latest test showed something that concerned her." James felt his heart race. "Thank you, Martha. I'll call right away." On the phone, Dr. Laura was direct. "Mr. Williams, Annie's cardiological exams revealed that her condition is more serious than we initially evaluated. She has a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that is progressively worsening." "What does that mean in practical terms, doctor?" "It means she will need cardiac surgery sooner than we expected. We're talking about months, not years." "And the risks?" "Every cardiac surgery has risks, especially in children, but the risks of not intervening are much greater." James felt the world spin around him. The idea of Annie facing high-risk surgery made his heart tighten in a way he didn't think he could feel anymore. "What do we need to do now?" he asked, trying to focus on the practical, on what he could control. "I'm going to refer her to Dr. Robert Vincent, the best pediatric cardiac surgeon in the country. He will do a complete evaluation and determine the best course of action." After hanging up, James found Annie in the library, leafing through a book of stories. He sat down beside her, thinking about how to explain the situation without frightening her. "Annie," he began, "you know we've been visiting doctors to take care of your heart, right?" She nodded, without raising her eyes from the book. "Doctor," Laura called, "and we need to visit one more doctor, a very good specialist who will help make your heart strong again. Annie finally looked at him and wrote in her pad, "I will need an operation." James blinked, surprised. "Yes, probably." "How? Do you know that?" "Mum told me in a dream, said not to be afraid." James swallowed hard, trying to control his emotion. "Your mum is right. There's no reason to be afraid. I'll be with you every step of the way." Annie smiled and wrote, "I know, Grandpa." Was the first time she had called him that, and James felt as if his own heart might explode with emotion. That night, while Annie slept, James received an unexpected call from Amanda Parker, the social worker. "Mr. Williams, sorry to bother you so late, but we need to talk urgently. Did something happen with the custody process?" "Yes and no. We received an anonymous complaint alleging that you obtained custody of Annie fraudulently and that she would be at risk under your care." James felt his blood boil. "That's absurd. Annie is receiving the best possible care." "I know that, Mr. Williams. I have observed her progress and it's evident that she is well, but we need to investigate the complaint. It's standard procedure." "Who would make such a complaint?" asked James, more to himself than to Amanda. "We don't know. It was anonymous. But there's more. The complaint came accompanied by supposed evidence that the letter establishing the kinship between you would be a forgery." James felt a chill down his spine as he remembered Annie's drawing of the mysterious man and the word danger. "Mrs. Parker, I think I know what's happening. Someone is trying to sabotage my relationship with Annie. Do you have any idea who it could be?" James hesitated. His mind immediately went to Greg, but he couldn't believe that his own son would go to such extremes. "I have suspicions, but I prefer to investigate before making accusations." "I understand. In any case, I'll need to make a visit tomorrow with a handwriting expert to analyze the original letter. It's just procedure." "Of course, we'll be waiting." After hanging up, James went to his office and opened the safe where he kept Olivia's original letter. He examined it carefully, looking for any sign of tampering, but everything seemed as authentic as the day Annie had handed it to him. Then, he remembered something Annie had drawn days ago. A man in a dark suit talking to another man in front of a building that looked like St. Clair's orphanage. At the time, he hadn't given it much importance, but now, James picked up his cell phone and called Mark, the head of security at his company. "Mark, I need you to investigate something for me with absolute discretion. I want to know if my son Greg has had any recent contact with Richard Ayres." Richard Ayres had been the financial director of the Williams Group for almost a decade, until being fired by James 3 years earlier, after discovering that he was embezzling company funds. The case was resolved internally, without involving the police, but Richard had left swearing revenge. "I'll check immediately, Mr. Williams. Any other instructions?" "Yes. I want reinforced security at the mansion and at St. Clair's orphanage. 24 hours a day. And don't mention this to anyone, especially Greg." The next morning, Amanda arrived accompanied by a handwriting expert who meticulously examined Olivia's letter. After almost 2 hours of analysis, the verdict was clear. "The letter is authentic, without a shadow of doubt," declared the expert. "The ink, the paper, the natural degradation over time, everything is consistent with a document that has the stated age." Amanda seemed relieved. "This settles this aspect of the complaint, Mr. Williams, but we still need to address the allegations." "Of risk? What allegations specifically?" asked James. "The complaint suggests that you would be using Annie to improve your public image without real interest in her well-being, and that you would be neglecting necessary medical care." James almost laughed at the irony. "Just when we're preparing for complex cardiac surgery with the best specialist in the country." "I know it's absurd," agreed Amanda. "That's why I'm here to document the real situation and close this investigation as soon as possible." Amanda spent the rest of the morning observing Annie in her daily activities, the lesson with the private tutor, the therapy session, lunch with James. The strong bond between grandfather and granddaughter was evident, as were the exceptional care she received. Before leaving, Amanda called James for a private conversation. "Mr. Williams, as a social worker, I've seen many cases of children in difficult situations. Rarely have I seen such a positive adaptation as Annie's. She clearly feels safe and loved here. Thank you for recognizing that, Mrs. Parker. There's one more thing I should mention, she continued, hesitant. This complaint. There's something strange about it. The tone, the specific accusations, they remind me of an old case I worked on. What case? A custody process involving the New Dawn Foundation almost 10 years ago. The foundation managed various orphanages upstate, including St. Clair's. For a brief period, James frowned. And what's strange about it? The same tactic was used. Anonymous complaints discrediting legitimate guardians, allegations of falsified documents. Later, we discovered that the foundation was embezzling government resources. When those responsible for some orphanages began to question the management, they were removed through these fabricated complaints. James felt the pieces falling into place. Mrs. Parker, by any chance, did Richard Ayres have any connection to this foundation? Amanda's eyes widened. Yes, he was the financial director. How do you know that? Let's say I have experience with Mr. Ayres's methods, and now I'm practically certain that he's behind this complaint against me. But why? What would his interest be in Annie? It's not in Annie, it's in me, and probably in St. Clair's orphanage as well. If he was involved in embezzlement there in the past, my rebuilding project and transparency could threaten to expose old skeletons. Before Amanda could respond, James's cell phone rang. It was Mark, the head of security. Mr. Williams, I have information. Greg and Richard Ayres were seen together 3 times in the last 2 weeks. The last meeting was yesterday at a restaurant closed for private events. James felt a knot in his stomach. His own son was involved. Thank you, Mark. Keep surveillance, and increase security at the orphanage immediately. After hanging up, James shared the information with Amanda. It seems my son is collaborating with Ayres. He probably feels I'm neglecting the company and him because of Annie. That's disturbing, Mr. Williams. If you're right about Ayres's connection to the orphanage's former administration, there may be more at stake than simple personal revenge. We need to discover exactly what's happening. Amanda, do you have access to the New Dawn Foundation's records? I can request them from the Child Protective Services archive. It will take a few days. Do that. In the meantime, I'll confront Greg. That night, James summoned Greg for dinner at the mansion. Annie was already asleep when he arrived, which was exactly what James wanted, a conversation without her presence. Thanks for coming, said James when they sat at the huge dining table, served with Greg's favorite meal, grilled salmon with passion fruit sauce, Martha's specialty. It seemed important from your tone on the phone, replied Greg, serving himself wine. Any problem with Annie? The casual way he asked, almost ironic, confirmed to James that something was wrong. Actually, yes, we received an anonymous complaint questioning my custody and alleging negligence. James carefully observed Greg's reaction, a slight furrowing of the brows followed by a studiedly neutral expression. That's absurd. Who would do such a thing? Asked Greg, avoiding his father's direct gaze. That's exactly what I'd like to know. James took a sip of water before continuing. Especially considering that you have been meeting regularly with Richard Ayres. Greg's fork stopped in midair. Are you spying on me? I'm protecting my family, and that includes you, Greg. My meetings with Richard are strictly professional. He has contacts that can help with international expansion. Contacts he cultivated while embezzling from our company. Don't take me for a fool, son. Greg put down his fork, his posture changing completely. What do you want me to say, Dad? That I'm worried about the direction things are taking? That I no longer recognize the man who taught me everything about business? You're throwing money at a forgotten orphanage and neglecting the company you built your entire life. And that justifies conspiring with a man who betrayed my trust? Using an innocent child as a pawn in your game? I don't know what you're talking about, replied Greg, but his wavering tone betrayed him. The anonymous complaint, Greg. The attempt to take Annie away from me. Were they your ideas or Richard's? Greg ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking exhausted. I just wanted you to see what's happening. That girl appears out of nowhere with a convenient letter, and suddenly you transform your entire life. For her? She's my granddaughter, blood of my blood. And what about me? What am I then? I only served until you had a biological heir. The genuine hurt in Greg's voice caught James by surprise. Behind the anger and questionable actions, there was a deep fear of abandonment. "Greg, you are my son. I chose you. Nothing will change that. Annie isn't here to replace you, but to complete our family. Then why did you push me away from important decisions? Why did you cancel our business trips? Why did you transfer to other directors' projects that were mine?" "Because I needed to reorganize my priorities, and I made mistakes in that process," admitted James. "But that doesn't justify what you did." Greg lowered his gaze, finally showing shame. "I didn't know Richard was planning to go so far. He said he would just raise questions about the legitimacy of the custody, forcing an investigation that would make you reconsider your choices." "And St. Clair's orphanage? What's his interest there?" Greg hesitated. He mentioned something about old records that needed to remain buried. Said that your intervention could bring to light things that many powerful people prefer to forget. Embezzlement? Probably, but I think it's more than that. He seemed genuinely nervous when he heard about your plans for the orphanage. James took a deep breath, trying to control his anger and disappointment. "Greg, do you have any idea what you've done? Annie is not an object to be disputed. She's a vulnerable child who has already lost almost everything in life. And now, because of your actions, she may lose the chance of a stable family just when she's facing serious health problems." "What health problems?" asked Greg, genuinely surprised. "She needs cardiac surgery, Greg. It's a serious condition that will require a high-risk procedure." Greg paled. "I didn't know. Richard didn't mention anything about health problems." "Of course not, because it's not about Annie for him. It's about revenge against me and protecting secrets from the past." A heavy silence fell over the table. Finally, Greg spoke. "What are you going to do now? Are you going to report me to the police?" "No, you're my son despite everything. But I demand that you immediately cut any contact with Richard Ayres and tell me exactly what he's planning. He mentioned something about neutralizing your intervention at the orphanage. He didn't give details, but the tone was threatening." James nodded, thoughtful. "I'll reinforce security there. And as for you, Greg, we have a lot to rebuild in terms of trust." "I know, and I'm sorry. I let jealousy and insecurity blind me. The question now is, are you willing to really get to know Annie? Give her and yourself a chance to build a family relationship?" Greg hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I owe that to you and to her." The next day, James received an alarming phone call from the supervisor of the construction at St. Clair's orphanage. "Mr. Williams, there's been a problem. Part of the roof structure collapsed during the night, almost hitting the children's dormitory. Were there any injuries?" "No, thank God. But it's strange. The area that collapsed had been inspected just yesterday and was stable. It seems someone deliberately cut the support beams." James felt a chill. "Sabotage. Reinforce security immediately, and don't let anyone enter the site without my express authorization." After hanging up, James found Annie in the garden, drawing as she did every morning. As he approached, he saw that she was drawing St. Clair's orphanage, but with part of the roof on fire. "Annie," he called with a trembling voice, Did you make this drawing?" she wrote. "This morning dreamed fire comes after wood breaks." James's blood froze. It wasn't just the roof that was in danger. There was a plan to set the place on fire. Immediately, James alerted Mark and the police, explaining his suspicions. A team was sent to inspect the orphanage, discovering inflammable materials strategically positioned at various points in the structure. "It seems someone was planning an accidental fire," reported the investigator, "probably to indefinitely delay the renovation or even make the building unrecoverable." That same day, Amanda Parker brought news about the New Dawn Foundation. "Mr. Williams, we found serious irregularities in the records. It wasn't just embezzlement. There was falsification of adoption documents, children being sent abroad without proper documentation, bribes to inspectors. And Richard Ayres was at the center of all this. He and other directors of the foundation. When the scandal was about to explode, they managed to hush up the case and transfer the administration of the orphanage to the current nuns, who had no knowledge of the previous irregularities. So my rebuilding project and the investigation that would inevitably accompany it would threaten to expose crimes that may be statutorily time-barred, but still devastating to the reputation of powerful people, completed Amanda. We need to take this to the police, decided James. I'm already preparing a complete dossier, assured Amanda, but there's one more thing you should know. During my research, I discovered something about Annie's mother, Lily. What would that be? She wasn't just raised in the orphanage. She began investigating the irregularities of the former administration shortly before she became ill. There are indications that she had gathered substantial evidence. James felt a chill. Are you suggesting that her illness might not have been natural? Amanda hesitated. I don't have proof, just suspicious temporal coincidences, but it's something the police should investigate. That night, while Annie slept, James remained in his office, analyzing all angles of the situation. His cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. James Williams, he answered. Mr. Williams, my name is Gabriel Santos, said a male voice with a slight foreign accent. I believe you're taking care of my daughter, Annie. James felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. Who are you exactly? I'm Annie's biological father. I've been out of the country for years due to an accident that affected my memory. Recently, I recovered my memories and found out about Lily and our daughter. When I learned that Lily had passed away, I came immediately to the United States. How can I know you're telling the truth? I have all the documents, including Annie's birth certificate with my name. I am in New York and would like to meet her, if you allow. James's mind was working quickly. Was this another ploy by Richard Ayres, or was it really Annie's father returning at the most critical moment? Mr. Santos, I understand your situation, but Annie is going through a delicate health moment. I suggest we meet first without her to discuss the situation. I completely understand. I just want to do what's best for my daughter. They arranged to meet the next day, at a neutral cafe. James hung up the phone with a heavy heart. If Gabriel Santos was really Annie's biological father, with legal rights over her, the entire world James had rebuilt in the last few weeks could crumble. The next morning, James met Gabriel, a man of about 40 with the same deep brown eyes as Annie. The resemblance was undeniable. Gabriel presented documents that proved his identity and related his story. How he met Lily during a business trip to the United States, how they maintained a long-distance relationship, and how he suffered a serious accident in Portugal that left him with amnesia. For years I lived without knowing who I really was, explained Gabriel. Only recently, with specific treatments, did I begin to recover memories. When I finally remembered Lily and Annie, I came as quickly as possible. And what do you intend now? Asked James directly. I want to meet my daughter, establish a relationship with her. Eventually, I would like her to come live with me in Lisbon, where I have my established life. But I understand that this should be a gradual process. James felt his heart tighten. The idea of losing Annie was unbearable. Mr. Santos, Annie has been through severe traumas. She hasn't spoken in 2 years. She's beginning to feel safe now, and soon she'll need to face complex cardiac surgery. Surgery? What kind of condition does she have? James explained in detail Annie's cardiac condition and the planned treatment. Gabriel listened with growing concern. Mr. Williams, I have no intention of causing more trauma to Annie. I suggest a collaborative approach. I can meet her as a family friend initially, without revealing my identity until she is prepared. And what about your intention to take her to Portugal? It's something to be considered in the future, not now. Her well-being comes first. James studied Gabriel carefully, trying to detect any sign of falsehood, but the man seemed genuinely concerned about his daughter. They agreed on a first supervised meeting the next day, in the presence of Annie's psychologist. Upon returning home, James found Annie agitated, drawing frantically. As he approached, he saw that she had drawn a man who looked very much like Gabriel, next to her mother Lily, both smiling at a baby. Annie, asked James with a trembling voice, who is this man in your drawing? She wrote, Daddy Gabriel, he's back. Mom showed in dream. James felt a chill. How could Annie know about Gabriel? He hadn't mentioned anything to her. Have you met him before, Annie? She shook her head negatively, then wrote, "Just photos and dreams. Mom said he lost his way but now found it again." That night, James could barely sleep, divided between the happiness of Annie potentially reconnecting with her biological father and the selfish fear of losing her. When he finally fell asleep, he dreamed of Rose, so vivid that she seemed real, telling him to trust the process, that some families are formed by unexpected paths. The meeting between Annie and Gabriel was both moving and disturbing. Annie, normally so cautious with strangers, ran into Gabriel's arms as soon as she saw him, as if she recognized him instantly. There was no need to introduce him as a family friend. Somehow she knew exactly who he was. Gabriel, in turn, was in tears as he hugged his daughter for the first time in so many years. They spent hours together, Annie showing her drawings, Gabriel telling stories of his travels, communicating through gestures and written words, as if they had been doing it all their lives. James observed from a distance with a divided heart. On one hand, it was beautiful to see Annie happy and connected. On the other, each moment reinforced the fact that Gabriel was her biological father, with a natural connection that James could never replicate. In the days that followed, Gabriel became a constant presence at the mansion. James, overcoming his initial jealousy, began to see in him an ally in caring for Annie. Together, they consulted specialists about the cardiac surgery, researched alternative treatments, and took turns to ensure that Annie always had company. During this time, the investigation into Richard Ayres and the former administration of St. Clair's orphanage progressed. Incriminating documents were found, and the police were about to make arrests. James kept Gabriel informed of everything, especially the possibility that Lily's illness might not have been natural. "If we discover that someone deliberately caused Lily's illness," said Gabriel with determination, "I will make sure that person faces justice." "We're together in this," affirmed James, extending his hand to Gabriel, who shook it firmly. It was an unlikely alliance, but one that strengthened, each day for Annie's benefit. Meanwhile, the date of Annie's surgery approached. Dr. Robert Vincent, after a complete battery of tests, confirmed the need for urgent intervention. "The cardiomyopathy is progressing faster than we expected," explained the doctor during a consultation with James and Gabriel. "Ideally, we would like to operate in the next 2 weeks." "The risks?" asked Gabriel, firmly holding Annie's hand, who was lying on the examination table. "They are significant, I won't lie, but the risks of not operating are even greater, and Annie has 2 factors in her favor, her youth and her extraordinary strength of spirit." Annie observed the conversation with attentive eyes, apparently calm despite the gravity of the situation. When the doctor finished speaking, she took her notepad and wrote, "I'm not afraid. Grandma Rose said everything will be fine." The 3 adults exchanged emotional looks. Annie's connection to the past, to memories that couldn't be hers, continued to surprise everyone. On the eve of the surgery, a week later, James was in the mansion's garden, contemplating the still young cherry tree he had planted for Annie. Greg approached silently. "Dad?" he called, hesitant. James turned, surprised by his son's presence, who had kept his distance in recent days, ashamed of his involvement with Richard Ayres. "Greg, I didn't expect to see you today. I came to see how you are, and bring some important information." James indicated the garden bench beside the tree. They sat down, the cool night air bringing the scent of newly planted flowers. "Richard Ayres was arrested this afternoon," announced Greg. "The police found evidence of his participation in the embezzlement scheme at the orphanage, and worse yet, indications that he may have tampered with medications that Lily was taking." James felt a chill run down his spine. So the suspicion was real. He really could have been responsible for her death. There's still no definitive confirmation, but the police found chemical formulas and dosages on his computer, along with Lily's name in password-protected documents. "How did you obtain this information?" Greg took a deep breath. "I went to the police voluntarily, Dad. I told them everything about my involvement with him, how I was manipulated, and I offered all the information I had." James studied his son's face, seeing sincere regret. "That was brave of you," he said finally. "It wasn't courage, it was a guilty conscience and shame. What I did, trying to separate you and Annie, was unforgivable. Nothing is unforgivable between father and son, Greg. Greg's eyes filled with tears, something James hadn't seen since he was a boy. How is Annie? I heard about tomorrow's surgery. She's frighteningly calm, stronger than any of us. I would like to... May I see her before the surgery? To wish her good luck? James nodded. She's in her room, drawing as always. I'm sure she would like to see you. When Greg entered Annie's room, he found her surrounded by dozens of drawings, some hanging on the walls, others spread across the floor. In the center of it all, Annie was drawing with concentration, her precise strokes forming what appeared to be the mansion's garden, but transformed, full of colors and life. "Hello, Annie," said Greg softly. She raised her gaze, studying him for a moment before offering a small smile and waving for him to approach. "I see you like to draw," he commented, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You have a lot of talent." Annie nodded and continued her drawing, adding a figure that Greg recognized as himself, next to James, Gabriel, and herself, all smiling under the cherry tree. "Is that how you see us, as a family?" he asked with a choked voice. Annie picked up her notepad and wrote, "Family is who stays when it's difficult." Greg felt the words hit him like a punch in the stomach. This child, whom he had tried to push away, offered him forgiveness and inclusion without hesitation. "Annie, I made mistakes. I was selfish and petty. But I want you to know that tomorrow I'll be there rooting for you. And afterward, if you give me a chance, I would like to be the uncle you deserve." She smiled again, more broadly this time, and wrote, "You'll like the new company. Different but better." Greg frowned, confused. New company? Annie just shrugged and returned to her drawing, leaving Greg intrigued by her words that seemed, as always, to contain knowledge beyond her time and experience. On the morning of the surgery, the family gathered at the hospital, James, Gabriel, Greg, and even Martha, who had insisted on being present. Annie, already prepared for surgery, seemed surprisingly serene while the doctors explained the last details of the procedure. "We're going to stay here the whole time," promised James, holding her small hand, "and when you wake up, we'll all be waiting for you." Annie nodded and wrote one last message before being taken away. "I know you will. Family always stays." The following hours were the longest of James's life. The surgery, expected to last 5 hours, entered its 6th hour without news. The silence in the waiting room was broken only by the occasional sigh of concern or the muffled sound of footsteps in the corridor. Finally, Dr. Vincent appeared, still wearing his surgical attire. His face, though tired, bore a smile. "The surgery was a success," he announced, to everyone's immediate relief. "Annie is an incredible fighter. We found and corrected the cardiac anomaly, and her vital signs remained stable throughout the entire procedure." "And the recovery?" asked Gabriel, his voice choked with emotion. "It will be gradual. She'll stay in the ICU for the next 2 days, and then a few more days in the hospital. But with proper care, she should recover completely." James felt his legs weaken with relief, needing to sit down. Greg placed his hand on his shoulder, offering silent support. "When can we see her?" asked James. "She's in the recovery room, now in about an hour. When she's transferred to the ICU, you can visit her briefly, one at a time." The following days were of constant vigil. James, Gabriel, and Greg took turns so that Annie was never alone when awake. Slowly she regained her strength, although she was still connected to various devices and monitors. On the 4th day after the surgery, while James was reading to her one of the adventure books that had become part of their nightly routine, Annie did something no one expected. "Grandpa," she said with a hoarse and low voice almost inaudible. James froze, the book forgotten in his hands. "Annie, you spoke?" "Grandpa," she repeated, a little stronger this time, her eyes shining with contained tears. James felt the world spin around him. After almost 2 years of silence, Annie had spoken, and her first word had been to call him. "Oh, my dear," he said, hugging her carefully to not disturb the tubes and monitors. "Your voice is the most beautiful sound I've ever heard." In the days that followed, Annie began to speak more and more, first isolated words, then short phrases. Her voice, initially weak from disuse, gained strength and confidence. The doctors and therapists called it a medical miracle, suggesting that the trauma of the surgery and her subsequent overcoming it may have been the catalyst to break the psychological block that prevented her from speaking. A week later, Annie was discharged from the hospital and returned to the mansion, where a small celebration awaited. Balloons, a welcome banner, and a cake decorated with the drawing of a cherry tree. "Welcome back, warrior," said Greg, who had helped Martha organize the surprise. "Thank you, Uncle Greg," replied Annie, her voice still soft but increasingly firm. That night, as James tucked her in, Annie asked to tell a story, not to hear one, but to tell one. "Grandma Rose told me a story in the hospital," she explained, "about you and her and a promise under the cherry tree." James felt himself shiver. "What promise, Annie?" "You promised that, no matter what happened, you would always take care of each other, even when you were far apart. And now you're taking care of me, who am part of her. The promise continues." James couldn't contain his tears. How could Annie know this? That promise between him and Rose had been made in private, a secret he had never shared with anyone. "It's true," he confirmed finally. "We made that promise. And I didn't fulfill it as I should have. Grandma Rose said you fulfilled it in your own way, that everyone has their own path, but all lead to the same place in the end." "And what place is that?" "The place where love never ends," answered Annie simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. With Annie's recovery progressing, by leaps and bounds, James turned his attention to St. Clair's orphanage. After Richard Ayres's arrest, investigations revealed a much larger scheme than initially suspected, involving local politicians and influential businessmen who had profited from embezzlement over the years. The rebuilding project, temporarily interrupted during the investigations, was resumed with renewed vigor. James, inspired by Annie, expanded the original scope. Beyond the physical renovation, the project now included the creation of an educational and medical foundation that would serve not only the orphanage's children, but the entire local community. "The Lily Harris Integrated Center," he announced during the cornerstone laying ceremony, 3 months after Annie's surgery. "A place of healing, learning, and above all, hope." Annie, dressed in an elegant blue dress, was at his side, smiling shyly at the small crowd gathered. The orphanage's nuns, the children, local authorities, and journalists invited to the event. "I would like the representative of this project to say a few words," continued James, extending his hand to Annie. "My granddaughter, Annie Harris Santos Williams." Annie approached the microphone, visibly nervous but determined. Her voice, now firmer after months of speech therapy, echoed clearly in the environment. "My mother grew up here," she began. "She always said that this place gave her a family when she needed it most. Now we want all children to feel the same, that they have a family, a safe place, and a bright future ahead." The applause was emotional. James watched with pride, alongside Gabriel and Greg, the extraordinary transformation of the silent girl he had found at the church door. As the ceremony proceeded, James noticed an elderly lady in the front row, observing Annie with tears in her eyes. He didn't recognize her initially, but something about her seemed strangely familiar. After the ceremony, the lady approached timidly. "Mr. Williams, my name is Teresa Oliver. I was Rose's friend for many years." James felt his heart race. "You knew Rose?" "Yes, until her last days. She asked me to deliver something to you, but I never managed to find you until I saw your photo in the newspaper announcing this project." Teresa opened her purse and removed a yellowed envelope, similar to the one Annie had originally brought. "Rose wrote this letter to you a few days before her passing. She knew she was ill but didn't want Lily or Annie to know the severity. She asked me to find you and deliver this, but you seemed unreachable, protected by secretaries and high walls." James accepted the envelope with trembling hands. "Thank you, Teresa. You can't imagine what this means. Rose loved you until the end, you know. Even after all those years, even after everything." That night, alone in his office, James finally found the courage to open the letter. Rose's elegant handwriting, so similar to Olivia's in the letter Annie had brought, filled his eyes with tears before he even began to read. "My dear James, if this letter has reached your hands, it means that I can finally tell you everything I've kept for decades, First, I want you to know that I never blamed you for your choices. We were young, scared, pressured from all sides. When I discovered I was pregnant, we had already been separated for weeks. I thought about telling you, but I heard that you had become engaged to Elizabeth, that your career was taking off. I didn't want to be an obstacle, a burden. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps fear. Either way, I decided to raise our daughter alone. Lily grew up knowing about you. I showed her photos, told stories, always emphasizing the good man you were, never what separated us. She tried to find you when she was 18, but was prevented by your then wife, who threatened her with lawsuits and scandals if she persisted. When Lily had Annie, I saw in her eyes your eyes, James, and I knew that somehow fate would find a way to unite what was separated. I am sick now, and my time is short. I don't want Lily or Annie to suffer watching my decline, so I will soon leave for treatment abroad, or that's what I told them. In truth, I will stay with my old friend Teresa, who will care for me in my last days. If you ever meet Annie, please tell her that her grandmother loved her immensely, and tell her that dreams tell truths that life sometimes hides. With eternal love, Rose. James reread the letter several times, tears flowing freely down his face. So many years lost, so many tragic coincidences, so many misunderstandings. And yet somehow fate had found a way to bring Annie, and through her, Rose, back into his life. The phrase about dreams that tell truths particularly resonated. Could it be that Annie really communicated with her grandmother and mother through dreams? Or were they just memories transmitted through stories, transformed by the extraordinary mind of a sensitive child? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The following months brought profound changes, not only for Annie, but for the entire Williams family. James, inspired by the Integrated Center project, began to completely restructure the Williams Group, officially placing Greg as CEO, while he himself assumed a more strategic position as chairman of the board. It's time for the new generation to take over, he explained during the formal announcement of the change, and for our company to embrace not just profit but also social responsibility. To the surprise of many, the Williams Group launched a new division focused exclusively on social impact projects, with investments in education, health, and sustainability. The value of the shares, far from falling as some analysts predicted, soared with the new approach that attracted ESG-oriented investors. Greg, initially skeptical about the change of direction, embraced the new challenge with growing enthusiasm. Annie was right, he commented to James after a particularly successful meeting. The new company is different but better. I'm beginning to understand what she meant. Gabriel, who had extended his stay in the United States indefinitely, became a consultant for the group's international division, using his contacts in Portugal and the rest of Europe to establish strategic partnerships. The question of where Annie would live had been resolved in a surprisingly harmonious way. She would spend most of the year in the United States with James, attending the local school, but would visit Gabriel in Portugal during school vacations. I have 2 homes now, she cheerfully explained to anyone who asked, and 2 families that have become one. The Lily Harris Integrated Center was officially inaugurated 1 year after the start of construction. What was once a decrepit orphanage had been transformed into a modern complex with a school, medical center, recreational and cultural areas, and renovated dormitories for the children who had not yet been adopted. This place saved my mother, said Annie during her speech at the inauguration ceremony, her voice now clear and confident, and now it will save many other children. The former director of the foundation, Richard Ayres, had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for embezzlement and evidence tampering. Investigations into his possible involvement in Lily's death continued, complex and lengthy due to the time that had passed. On a particularly hot summer afternoon, as the family gathered in the mansion's garden for a barbecue, a new tradition instituted by Greg, James observed Annie running across the lawn, chasing a kite that Gabriel had brought from his last trip to Portugal. She's completely recovered, commented Gabriel, approaching with 2 glasses of lemonade. The doctors say her heart is perfect now. On the outside and inside, replied James, accepting the drink. Annie has the most generous heart I've ever known. She has taught us a lot, hasn't she? More than she'll ever know. Martha approached, bringing a tray with fruit. Mr. James, look, the cherry tree has its first fruits. It was true. The tree James had planted when Annie arrived was now covered with small dark fruits, still developing but clearly visible. Annie, called James, come see. Annie came running, her eyes lighting up when she saw the fruits. The cherries, Grandma Rose said they would bear fruit when our family was complete. James smiled, hugging her by the shoulders. And she was. Right, as always. That night, as he tucked Annie in, a ritual they maintained even now that she was almost 10 years old, James noticed a new framed drawing on the wall of her room. It was an extraordinarily detailed family portrait for a child. James, Gabriel, Greg, Martha, and Annie herself, all sitting under the cherry tree. But there were two additional figures, semi-transparent, as if they were there and not there at the same time, a young woman who looked very much like Annie, and an older woman with intensely familiar eyes. Lily and Rose, murmured James, recognizing them immediately. They are always with us, said Annie, following his gaze. Grandma Rose says that love knows no boundaries, not even between this world and the other. James kissed his granddaughter's forehead. Your grandmother was always wiser than all of us. She said you will meet again someday, but not too soon. You still have much to do here. Like taking care of a certain very special granddaughter. Annie smiled, snuggling into the pillows and building more centers like Mum's and planting more cherry trees. It's a good life plan, agreed James, turning off the lamp. Sleep well, my love. Good night, Grandpa. I love you. I love you too, Annie, more than words can express. 6 months later, the Lily Harris Integrated Center had become a national model, replicated in other cities with the support of the Williams Foundation. Annie, now an applied and communicative student, made a point of visiting the center regularly, reading stories to the younger children and helping with art projects. The mansion, once cold and empty, had been transformed into a true home. The gardens, redesigned with Annie's active participation, were full of fruit trees, colorful flowers, and spaces to play. James's former formal office had been converted into a music room where Annie practiced piano under the guidance of teacher Claire. Greg, initially concerned about losing his place in the family, had found his own happiness, recently announcing his engagement to Marina, an architect he had met during the Integrated Center project. Do you think she'll like this ring? He asked nervously to Annie, showing the engagement ring. She'll love it, assured Annie, and you'll have beautiful babies. Hey, let's take it easy there, psychic, laughed Greg, affectionately messing up his niece's hair. First the wedding, then we'll see about babies. On a special Sunday afternoon, the family celebrated Annie's 10th birthday with a party in the garden. Friends from school, children from the Integrated Center, neighbors, and work colleagues gathered to celebrate. In the midst of the festivities, Annie discreetly pulled James aside, leading him to the cherry tree, now loaded with ripe fruit. Grandpa, I want to tell you something, she said seriously. What is it, dear? Grandma Rose doesn't come to my dreams anymore. James felt a tightness in his chest. No? Do you miss her? A little. But she said her mission was complete, that now we can go on alone. Annie looked up, observing the dark fruits among the green leaves. She said she's at peace now, that we are all where we should be. James hugged his granddaughter, moved. Your grandmother is right, as always. At that moment, Gabriel approached, bringing a gift wrapped in colorful paper. Time for presents. Birthday girl. Annie smiled, her eyes shining with expectation. Around them the party continued. Children's laughter, animated conversations, soft music in the background. James observed everything with a feeling of fullness he never imagined possible again. Somehow, through the most unlikely circumstances, life had given him a second chance. A chance to love, to redeem himself, to build something greater than himself. The cherry tree under which they stood, planted on the day Annie came into his life, was now strong and leafy, its roots firmly established in the soil. Like the family they had built, unlikely, diverse, united by bonds that transcended blood and time. And as Annie opened her presents, surrounded by people who loved her. James was certain that wherever Rose was, she was smiling. That soaked and silent girl, found by chance on a stormy night, had transformed not just his life but the lives of everyone around her. The empire that James had built over decades seemed insignificant compared to the treasure he now possessed. A true family, a renewed purpose, and the unconditional love of an extraordinary granddaughter. The true legacy he would leave would not be measured in bank figures, but in lives touched, in smiles provoked, in cherry trees planted. And that, James thought as he watched Annie enthusiastically hug Gabriel for the gift received, was worth more than all the gold in the world. End of story. Dear listener, did you enjoy the journey of James and Annie? Leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more moving stories like this one. Share in the comments what you thought of the Millionaire's transformation, and if you've ever experienced something that changed your life forever,